So here's what I genuinely cannot stop thinking about, because on a quiet afternoon inside the Blue Room of Buckingham Palace, King Charles III sat down directly across from his wife, looked her straight in the eye, and asked her one single cold question that would shatter the royal family forever. Who is he? And the way Camilla apparently handled that exact moment tells you absolutely everything you need to know about why this entire situation unraveled the way it did, because she did not come clean. She did not have a clear explanation, and according to the internal reports that have been flying around the palace walls, she just started rambling, incoherently mentioning something about an old acquaintance from years ago, something about a wellness retreat she needed to attend, and something about how Charles was just too busy with Parliament anyway. So she had simply gone off on her own to find some peace. The explanation was incredibly messy, it was disjointed, and honestly, if you're going to get caught in a situation this explosive, you would think you would at least have your story straight before walking into a room with the king. But she did not. And that is where this whole thing starts to get really interesting, because what Charles had spread out on the desk in front of him was not just mere suspicion or rumors. It was a heavy security folder full of time-stamped photographs, internal security reports, travel logs, and encrypted messages that all pointed in one very uncomfortable direction, the kind of evidence that does not leave a lot of room for excuses. Or let me explain before we get into full timeline. Though we must look at the photos in that folder, which were taken between May 11th and May 13th at a secluded private estate near Windsor, and the man in those photos was not some mysterious stranger from outside palace circles. It was Edward Langley, a longtime employee of the royal household, someone who had been around for years, someone who was supposed to be completely trustworthy, and someone who absolutely should not have been seen embracing the queen consort in a private room with wine during what witnesses described as clearly intimate moments. This was not a simple case of two old friends catching up, because the security team had verified everything. The photos were completely real. Edward's travel records confirmed he was there, his arrival time, his departure time, all of it lined up perfectly. And here is the specific detail that makes it so much worse. Charles had been under the strict impression that Camilla was on a solo wellness retreat, because that is exactly what she had told him. She needed some peace, some clarity, and some time away to recharge her health. And instead, she was at a private estate with another man, while Charles sat at home, believing his wife was off taking care of herself. That is not just cheating, that is a calculated deception wrapped in the language of self-care. But the photos were only the beginning, because Charles understandably wanted to know more. And once he started digging, what he found went way beyond infidelity. This is where the story takes a turn that I do not think anyone saw coming, because the investigation traced Camilla's movements back to April 22nd, and that is when the Royal Heirloom Vault situation came to light. Now, for context, the Royal Heirloom Vault is not just some storage closet. It is where some of the most historically significant and personally meaningful pieces in the entire monarchy are kept under strict security. Access is extremely limited. Everything is documented, and there are protocols in place that have existed for decades. But on April 22nd, Camilla accessed that vault, claiming it was for heritage research, which on its own would not raise any flags. But what happened next is where the red flags start waving, because that same week a locked trunk left the palace with her with no proper documentation filed, and no one questioned that the trunk just disappeared. And when investigators followed the trail, that same trunk showed up at the suite near Windsor, where Camilla had been staying, with Edward surveillance footage from April 23rd showed a vehicle belonging to Camilla parked outside that suite for nearly an hour, where the trunk was taken out and never brought back. By July 1st, a full report landed on Charles' desk, and the summary was devastating, showing Camilla had entered the vault without proper authorization, using an override code that had not been active since 2014, which raises its own set of dangerous questions about how she got it and why it was still functional on that day. Two specific items went missing: Diana's caterpillar earrings and the Spencer choker, valued at over $650,000. But honestly, the monetary value is almost beside the point of Charles, and really to anyone who understands what Diana meant to this family and to the public. Those pieces are priceless. They are artifact of a woman's life, a mother's legacy, a princess who was taken far too soon, and now they were gone. Camera footage from Clarence's house showed Camilla's car parked near the loading area for 45 minutes on the exact same day the items disappeared, with no documentation submitted. And just silence. When you actually look at what was said versus what happened, the contradiction is impossible to ignore. She said she was doing research, but research does not involve override codes, locked trunks, and missing heirlooms, and then there were the messages discovered on Camilla's secured tablet in her private room, which painted an even darker picture showing the communications with Edward were not just romantic. They hinted at something more calculated, talking about a desire for freedom, a desire for possession, and no intention whatsoever of bringing that trunk back or providing any explanation for where the items had gone, suggesting this was not a spur-of-the-moment mistake. It was planned, it was coordinated, and involved actively removing pieces of royal history. For personal reasons, Charles reportedly sat completely alone in his room after reading everything, staring at the empty space where Diana's choker used to be kept, because it captures exactly what this whole situation is about. It is not just about a marriage falling apart. It is about what was taken, who it belonged to, and the complete disregard for what those items represent to the world. The intense confrontation inside the Blue Room did not end with that initial question, because Charles did not yell. He did not make a dramatic scene, and by all accounts from those close to the staff, he stayed completely composed, which honestly made the entire atmosphere even more terrifyingly intense as he slowly laid out folder after folder onto the mahogany table, showing precise vault records and access logs that proved Camilla had entered the restricted area multiple times between April 18th and April 22nd using the highly confidential special override code that should have been decommissioned over a decade ago. She had signed in at exactly 9:42 a.m. on one specific occasion and did not leave the area until after 1 p.m. return with a large heavy trunk that was never inspected by the guards and never came back to the palace grounds. When Charles presented this undeniable paper trail, Camilla reportedly went completely pale. Her lips were visibly shaking, and she found it utterly impossible to look him in the eye as she tried desperately to maintain some weak version of her original story, but it was falling apart in real time right before her eyes. And then Charles brought up Diana's name, pointing out with a cold, steady voice that Diana's memory still matters deeply, not just in the past, but inside the palace walls, in the public's mind, and in the eyes of everyone who still mourns her legacy. To this day, he moved slightly closer to Camilla, not out of sudden anger, but out of profound sadness, because this was no longer just about being cheated on as a husband. It was about what had been used to manipulate the situation, which was Diana's sacred inheritance. And then came the detail that honestly makes your jaw drop completely, because Diana's famous 1986 pearl earrings, the ones gifted by Qatar, which she famously wore to the London Opera on October 14th of that year, were officially noted as missing from the secure safe, with no one authorizing their removal and no one ever mentioning moving them anywhere. But just a few days earlier, those exact historical earrings had been spotted by senior staff members on Camilla's daughter Laura Lopez during a high-profile public event. Charles demanded an immediate explanation, but Camilla simply cried and refused to give a direct answer, calling it a massive misunderstanding and claiming there was absolutely no ill intent behind it. But honestly, the fact that she would not just answer the simple question is the weirdest part of this whole ordeal, because how do Diana's personal earrings end up on your daughter's ears without anyone in the royal administration knowing about it? How does something like that happen completely by accident when logistics alone make absolutely no sense? You do not accidentally access a highly secure vault. You do not accidentally bypass elite military security. You do not accidentally remove one of the most documented pieces of jewelry in the entire royal collection and then accidentally put them on your daughter for a public appearance. That is not a simple misunderstanding. That is a calculated series of deliberate choices made behind closed doors. That night, Charles was heard speaking very quietly to a loyal aide, not raging or yelling, but looking completely exhausted, saying that the betrayal did not just hurt him personally, it tarnished the memory of two most important women in his life, his late mother, the Queen, and the woman he ultimately could not protect in the past. He stayed up past dawn by the fire in his private room, watching flames and thinking about Diana's face, her voice, and the exact warning she had given him years ago that so many people had dismissed as mere paranoia. By 7 a.m. the next morning, his final decision was made. Camilla's access to all royal vaults will be permanently removed. She would be completely excluded from confidential royal councils. Her name would be stripped off ceremonial permissions within 48 hours, with no press release, no public statement, just total silence and swift clinical action. But while all of this was happening behind closed doors, someone else in the palace was paying very close attention, because Princess has always been incredibly sharp, always been observant, and she had been watching the situation develop with growing concern for weeks, noticing the subtle glances, the hushed conversations, and the missing heirlooms, choosing to wait not. because she did not care, but because she wanted to make sure when she finally acted it would be absolutely decisive, and that moment came sooner than anyone expected on June 29th, just days before the Blue Room confrontation. There was a small lunch at Buckingham Palace to celebrate Princess Charlotte's charity milestone, where only 32 people were invited, consisting of immediate family and close aides, with no reporters or fanfare allowed. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, arrived at 12:14 p.m. wearing a beautiful light blue dress, which was the exact same dress Diana had worn to a charity event back in 1995, serving as a subtle but unmistakable tribute. And almost immediately something caught her sharp attention, because Laura Lopez was sitting by the north window, and she was wearing earrings that were not just any pretty accessories. There were 3 pearls with diamond caps dangling delicately, catching the light in a way that made Catherine's royal instincts kick in. Immediately recognizing them from the archives and knowing those earrings had a dark history of strict documentation and belonged entirely to Diana, Catherine did not make a public scene. She calmly asked her assistant to bring the official catalog of family heirlooms from the archive, looking through it to find the exact entry, and confirming what she already heavily suspected, that the earrings were the 1986 Qatar diamond drops, given to Diana during her Middle East trip, documented with a unique serial number and a specific class design that could not be replicated. And here's the key detail. They were specifically designated for Princess Charlotte, meant to be held in trust until her 18th birthday in 2043, never supposed to leave the vault, and certainly never supposed to be on Laura Lopez. At 12:42 p.m., Catherine approached Laura and asked completely calmly, "Can you tell me where you got those earrings?" And as the question hung heavily in the air, Laura looked completely surprised, struggled to find her words, and eventually said they were a gift from her mother, which she now considered hers. Catherine did not argue. She simply turned and handed the earrings to the palace gem expert, who had been alerted due to recent security concerns, and by 1 p.m. the results came back, confirming the earrings were genuine originals, last documented in March 2023, safe in storage and never authorized for removal, making the discovery completely indisputable. So when Prince William returned home that evening at 10:08 p.m., Catherine met him with a quiet greeting and said just one word: confirmed. And that was all it took to shift the entire atmosphere in the palace overnight, as staff began behaving differently, doors closed more carefully, and messages were communicated without speaking a single word, leading Charles to receive a private message and immediately cancel all his remaining engagements to meet with legal advisors, because the issue was no longer just about jewelry. It was about someone attempting to claim a piece of history that did not belong to them, not through birthright, not through responsibility, and certainly not through love, but through something much more calculated and sinister. On July 3rd, a secure meeting was held at Buckingham Palace, where only 5 people were present, consisting of King Charles, Prince William, Princess Catherine, Princess, and a senior royal advisor, with the heavy wooden doors locked tight and a thick, palpable tension filling the entire room, as this was no longer about planning a public event or discussing ordinary state obligations, but about deciding exactly how to handle a catastrophic internal crisis that struck directly at the very foundation of what the monarchy represents to the nation. Charles sat grimly at the head of the table with detailed files spread out wide in front of him, containing the scandalous photo security records, gemologist reports, and heirloom discrepancy notes, beginning his address completely devoid of emotion, stating clearly that this was no longer a private family matter, but a strict matter of royal protocol and centuries-old customs that exist specifically to protect the institution from exactly this kind of internal damage. Princess, and was visibly furious, her face starkly pale, and her hands clenched tightly, as she understood that this was not just about personal emotional hurt, but about the systematic misuse of family history, the exploitation of grief, and a complete lack of respect for their late mother's memory. Prince William stayed entirely silent for a very long time before speaking just one single sentence that carried the weight of years of quiet suffering and unwavering resilience, while Catherine sat directly beside him with a newly created file containing a meticulous inventory of the Royal Vault, not needing to say a word, because her poised presence alone communicated that she was fully prepared for whatever legal and constitutional consequences came next, which led Charles to issue 5 direct and uncompromising orders stating that Camilla's access to the palace would be suspended starting July 4th. She could no longer enter any royal residences. Her communication team would be permanently reassigned. The access codes to the vaults and private archives would be completely changed before midnight. Her security detail, previously provided by the Crown, would be withdrawn, and while she would technically retain the title of Queen Consort and name only all of her official royal duties, would be stripped away with no big announcement, no cameras, and no podium as this defining moment was made in secret, but with massive implications that would echo far. Beyond the palace walls, that night Camilla was completely alone at Clarence House when a sealed formal letter arrived from King Charles, where at the very end he had written 3 words in his own handwriting trust has been lost. And the next day the palace began quietly arranging for her relocation, but royal secrets are hard to keep, and on July 6th the story broke wide open as the Times ran a shocking front page headline that read Queen Camilla in secret affair and jewel theft scandal, including photos from a Windsor retreat showing Camilla walking hand in hand with Edward in private gardens, alongside details about the unauthorized vault entries, and the side-by-side comparison of Laura Lopez wearing Diana's 1986 Qatar diamond drops next to an archival photo of Diana, which generated nearly 5 million views in just 12 hours, causing social media to explode globally with furious public reactions, because it was about what the jewelry represented, which was memory history. An enduring love people still have for Diana, turning a royal scandal into a national moment of grief and anger within the palace staff, worked around the clock to rearrange offices and prepare for the massive fallout as the BBC interrupted regular programming for a live broadcast titled The Queen, Who Crossed the Line, while a public poll conducted on July 7th showed Camilla's approval rating had dropped to an all-time low of just 21%, while Catherine's popularity surged to 85%, establishing her as a reassuring figure and a symbol of hope for the future protection of the royal legacy, which led Charles to sign a final document making Camilla's exile permanent with no possibility of return, no forgiveness, and no second chances, stripping her of all ceremonial roles, banning her from royal events, and cutting off all communication with the royal family as palace security changed the digital locks and reset the biometric systems, removing her name from internal lists entirely. So by 6 p.m. her belongings were packed, and she was driven away in a private black car to Raymill House in Wiltshire, forbidden from entering royal property, without written consent, looking like a ghost in her own life, while Charles placed a private note about responsibility next to the portraits of Queen Elizabeth and Princess Diana in his study, signaling a complete erasure of the past. And as Camilla faded from view, the public attention shifted entirely to Catherine, who walked into the Royal Vault at Windsor Castle with the Crown's head archivist to carefully secure every single artifact connected to Diana, including the 1980-1 Spencer choker and the 1980-5 sapphire brooch changing the locks, so that moving forward only Catherine and the future royal steward would be permitted entry, adding one final envelope addressed to Charlotte that read, "For Charlotte from her mother with love and strength and memory," a powerful moment of preservation that solidified Catherine's position not just as a princess or a wife, but as a true keeper of history, the mother of a future queen, and the unspoken pillar holding the royal family together, while Camilla's story ended in complete collapse with the trunk never returning, the earrings restored to their rightful place, and the monarchy moving forward into a much brighter future.